I want you to think for just a minute about that moment when life was full, when just for even a split second, you could not imagine life getting better. Everything was just full. You could do anything at that moment because things were so great. I remember driving away for the first time from the driver's license test place, first taste of freedom in my 1986 Dodge Caravan, looking very cool. It was yeah, freedom, what's up? I can do whatever. I loved it. I remember running out on the turf, the first time we ever got to play football on TV, junior and senior year, running out to play for the state championship. Never mind that I ran into one of my teammates in our face mask lock and it looked like we were making out on TV. Other than that, it was awesome. You know what I'm saying? This is the greatest moment ever. Have you had these moments? I remember my graduation speech. I got invited to speak. And I got to tell my whole school that success is not found in all the places the world looks, but instead in doing exactly what God has called us to do at exactly the right time and exactly the right way. It was awesome. It's man, it cannot get better than this. I told you about my family just a few minutes ago. Here's a picture of them. I remember the moment that the doors opened and she was standing there in white, ready to walk down the aisle, and the moment she said, yes, come on, life could not get better than in that moment. It was so good. And I could tell you about the moments when I got to welcome all 4 of those kids into the world and hold them for the very first time, especially after one of them was born and God did this amazing miracle with depression in our family and just rescued my wife. I wish I could tell you this story. It's such a good story. Life could not get better than in that moment. I remember sitting by a pool in the Dominican Republic when God showed up in a way in my life that he had never shown up before. And I knew it was going to be a whole new story. It was so good. Have you had these moments? Can you think of those moments? Can you remember the place and the time and the way you felt and what was going on? You can probably remember every single detail. This guy Peter had moments like this. In fact, he wrote about it 30 years after the story as we pick it up this morning. In this letter that he wrote to the church, he writes it this way in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3. He says, what a God we have. And how fortunate we are to have him, the Father of our Master Jesus. Because Jesus was raised from the dead, we've been given a brand new life and have everything to live for, including a future in heaven, and the future starts now. God is keeping careful watch over us in the future. And the day is coming when you will have it all, life healed and whole. Peter is so full he can barely contain himself as he starts to write this letter where life was just so full. How does it get any better than this? But the moment we're looking at is not that moment. The moment we pick up the story from this morning is the opposite of that moment. You see, it's 30 years before, and I wonder if in that moment he could even imagine writing something as beautiful as that. Matthew records the story. Luke records the story where Peter betrays the one. He denies the one he said he would never turn his back on. And at the very moment of his deepest, darkest failure, the sound Jesus said would come sounds, and his eyes connect with the one who he loved more than anyone, and the realization of his failure set in. Can you imagine how it felt? Of course you can. You know exactly how it felt, don't you? You're no newbie to failure. It's not news to you. In fact, if I asked you to hold out your right hand, hold out your right hand. And if I asked you to just visually place in that hand failure from your life, I bet you could call it to mind quicker than the life to the full moments. In fact, I bet it would start to just pile up. It would be all kinds of things. Right? It would be embarrassing moments, like the time where I went to college for the first time. I thought I was just planning to pick up basketball, but instead it turned out to be a college tryout where everyone from the school came to watch. Pick off a pass at the top of the key. The only thing I had going for me was speed. I'm running down the court. I go up for a layup, not a dunk. You can tell why. And Instead, my leg just caves, and instead of going up, I go down. And you know that sound that skin makes on the floor when it's sliding across? That came to an abrupt halt when I hit the wall, so thanks for the wall. Could be embarrassing moments, could be something like that. It could be after my first driver test where I ran a stop sign and they failed me. My bad. It could be stuff like that. It could be the walk off those state championship fields where we lost both of them by 2 points, the thing we had worked all season for, 2 years for by the second one. Failures. Could be that. Could be sophomore basketball, where I was standing in the middle of practice. Coach blows the whistle, stops everyone, gets their attention, walks right over to me, right in my face, and at full volume goes, "Moore, you got a hell of a defense, but when it comes to offense, you don't have a clue." You got stuff in your hand? I want us to go on a journey together tonight, and I'm going to shoot you straight. It's not going to be very fun. But we really have to do something with this if we're going to see the beauty of what Jesus has done for us. And so I'm going to encourage you to be brave. Hold that hand out. Go past the embarrassing moments. Go past the times that you were called out. In fact, the braver you are and the more you put in this hand, the more Jesus can do in your life as we talk through this evening. Feel the weight. Call to mind the places and the emotions. Put yourself in the place of Peter. Maybe it's a time like Peter where you completely overestimated your ability, and at the time you had a chance to come through in the clutch, you completely fell down. Where you thought you were something and found out you weren't. Times like that. How brave do you want to be? How far will you let Jesus in? Maybe it's more like this. Maybe it's a time where you said you would do something, and it was so important to you. You stood up in front of others. In fact, maybe it was a Kingdom Worker card last year, or this thing that you've been convinced that God was calling you to, and you stand in front of your youth group and you're like, this is what I'm going to do, but you don't want to talk about it anymore because you never did it. Kind of like Peter, who said, I'll be with you to the end, and he totally failed. Maybe for some of you, I know you want to wiggle out of this, but don't. Put it right here. Maybe it's that thing that you said you would never do. You could never imagine being the kind of person who would do this. And you don't want to think about it. You don't want to touch it. You don't want to remember. You don't want to call it to mind because it hurts and it stings and the hand is starting to get heavy. Just place it there. Or maybe like Peter, there's that person that you never in your life wanted to let down. And you had to look them in the eye the moment that you disappointed them. Students, I want to tell you that what you do with this right here can change everything. That there's one thing you can do with what's right here, and I can tell you what your and then is going to be. I've seen it a lot of times. In fact, we'll see a story of it here in just a minute. But there's this other thing you can do with this. What are you going to do with the failure? The thing that's real, because the truth is that every single one of us has a handful. We all think that we're alone. We all think that we're the only one. But the truth is if you look down the aisle, you got a whole bunch of people who can barely hold their hand up. Because every single one of us has failed. And what you do with that, what you do with failure, can change everything. I want you to just set that for a second. Matthew steps away from the story of Peter. In fact, he leaves Peter in much the emotion that you may be feeling. We leave Peter at Matthew chapter 27. He says that he leaves Peter running away, weeping bitterly. asking the same question that we're going to ask, what do we do with failure? And then he picks up the story of this other guy. This other guy in Matthew chapter 27, who was a lot like Peter. He was one of those guys who said, you know what, Jesus, I will follow you. He was there when Peter said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. He was there when Peter said, I will go with you to the end. He was there when they sent them out 2 by 2 and came back and celebrated that even the demons obeyed. And Jesus said, don't celebrate that. You know me. He was there. He was at the Last Supper. He was one who had set everything aside. He dropped the rock and said, Jesus, I'm with you. But he was also the one who along the way said, you know what, 30 pieces of silver sounds really, really good. And the very thing he said he would do, he didn't do. And in Matthew chapter 27, we catch the story of Judas, who was the one who sold Jesus out for just a little bit of money. But like you and like Peter, he was a guy who had to face this because he watched what happened to Jesus. And he had this emotion that all of us have wrestled with, this idea of regret, of not knowing what to do with failure. In fact, we pick it up in Matthew chapter 27, verse 3. It says this, when Judas, who had betrayed Jesus, realized that Jesus had been condemned to die, he was filled with remorse. Anybody relate? When you call this to mind, is that the emotion that comes to mind? So he took 30 pieces of silver back to the leading priests and elders. He says, I have sinned, he declared, for I have betrayed an innocent man. And here's our nightmare come to life in Judas. They look at him and they say, what do we care? That's your problem. And Judas is stuck holding this failure. He didn't want to live with this. He made a huge mistake, and every single one of us can relate, because there's not a single person within earshot who doesn't know exactly what failure feels like. And it's just stuck in his hand, and it's weighing heavy. And he's like, what do I do with this? And he didn't know where to go. And so he goes right back to the place where he had acquired the failure. And he tries desperately to give it back. Have you ever tried to just take it back? I've sat down with so many students. 15 years in student ministry as a math teacher and a football coach and a volunteer, and then for years in paid ministry. And I've sat down with so many students who come in with a handful that they never thought they would have to carry. And they can't get rid of it. They don't know what to do with it. And they come to me and they just want to give it back. And I just want to be able to say that they can. But here's the problem, is that you can't give it back. You can't ungossip. You can't unbetray your friend. You can't unbreak that promise. You can't unwatch that thing on the internet. You can't unsee it. You can't stop imagining it. You can't undisappoint your parents and it just sits in your hands. You can't unsleep with them. I just want to look at this girl and say, you can't. I wish you could. But you can't unabort that baby. I'm just stuck holding it. And they're asking this question that I wonder if you've asked yet. What do I do with this failure? This kid in my youth group, his name was Ryan. I love this kid. In fact, CIY was a big part of the story of how I met Ryan. You see, students at CIY one year decided they were bored at like midnight or something, well after bedtime, and so they start making up games, and they go up into this dark floor of the dorm, and these guys, when I walk up there, all I know is there are guys dragging legs, groaning like zombies, and biting one another. That's all I know. Apparently, it was a game that they created called Wombies, where you're a werewolf zombie and you're walking around dragging a leg, groaning in the dark, and if you find someone, you bite them, and they're now infected. Until everybody's a wombie, then it starts over. Don't do that. It's a horrible idea. You're welcome, youth leaders. My bad. Anyway, here's the beauty of it. You ready? Is that when we get back from CIY, when we get back from Move, that these guys were so excited about it, they want to play at the church. And so they start inviting tons of guys from all over their communities. And one of these guys who shows up at our church to play Wombies is a kid named Ryan. And all of a sudden, this kid who had been kind of isolated and on his own was now just part of this dynamic community. And he saw the beauty of Jesus. And with the eagerness that so many of you showed when you dropped the rock last night, he got baptized. He stepped into this walk with Jesus. He jumped into our community. He was awesome. We laughed so much together. He was such an impulsive dude. He was celebrating this whole story of Jesus. He'd been adopted out of Russia when he was 2 years old, and so the whole story of being adopted by God made so much sense to him. He had a family. He had a place to belong. He was hilarious. He was impulsive. He was that guy who in youth group would ask crazy questions, you know? Like he was super far, like he didn't quite know the whole Bible or anything like that, so he would ask crazy questions like, hey man, I've always wanted to be Robin Hood when I grow up, but like if I rob banks and give it to missions, is that cool? Like, it's closer. We'll just call that a step in the right direction, bud, okay? We're just going to keep going on this journey. But like every other teenager, Ryan, he failed. You know, he's impulsive. Everybody makes bad choices. And he started collecting some, and one day he stole a teacher's phone. You know, it seems like a really big deal. Felt like a huge deal to him. And then something happened as he had the phone, and as he was carrying it around, he ended up breaking the phone. And so now he had like doubled his problem. Not only was he now a thief, but he was a vandal, and he had no idea how to undo this thing. And the truth was he'd been impulsive lots of times, and he was in trouble. And the question wasn't going to be whether he was suspended. The question was going to be whether he was expelled. And he didn't know where to take this. And the enemy started with him doing what he does with all of us. And he said, you know what, it's not just those two things, Ryan. It's this and this and this from your past and this from your past and this thing you did over here. And he starts to fill this thing up, and Ryan is just weighing heavy. And he's carrying this thing around. He doesn't know how he's going to get out of it. He doesn't know what he's going to do next. He cannot imagine how this could ever turn out okay. He could not imagine how life would ever be good again. And it weighed on him, and it weighed on him. He didn't know where to take it. He couldn't undo it. And then he bought the other lie. And you know what the other lie is. It's exactly what these Pharisees throw in Judas's face. He says, that's your problem. And Ryan bought the lie that he was all alone in it. Just the lie that you're caught all the time in. Yeah, you're the only one who's addicted to that internet. You're the only one who's ever done that. You're the only one. No one will understand. This is your problem. You own it. It's yours. Carry it. There's nowhere to put it. And you can try to stuff it in your pocket, just like we talked about this morning, and like pretend that it's not there. But the problem is in quiet moments. In places that you remember, you got to push it back down again, and it's right there just lurking under the surface all the time. You think you've gotten rid of it. You think you sat down, but you turn your hand over it and realize it's still stuck there, and it's yours. And no one will understand, and no one will go with you. You just got to own it. And accusations start to pile up, and the guilt starts to pile up, and the shame of what if people found out starts to pile up, and the pain that you can't get rid of because of that stuff piled up in your hand, your own unique blend of failure. And you start to believe this lie that you're finished, that there's nowhere to go, that you're all alone. And Ryan, he started to believe the lie that he was finished. So instead of letting anybody in, instead of calling anybody up, he did exactly what Judas did. Matthew 27:5 says, then Judas threw the silver coins down in the temple, and he went out and hanged himself. I remember flying from Vegas back to Illinois for his funeral. So angry. Sin killed stuff. That's what it does. this failure that he owned, and he didn't know what to do with it. He carried it alone, just like Judas, and it was fatal. Not everyone who carries this and doesn't know what to do with it ends their life, but they die slowly from the pile-up, from the hiding, from the self-medicating. You know, when you get enough, you don't know what to do. You don't know how to get away. And so what you do is you try to escape. Some people try to escape through success and achievements and accolades. Some people try to escape through substance and experience. Some people try to escape through relationship after relationship after relationship. But the truth is there's nowhere to hide. And eventually it's fatal. I get it. We try to wiggle out of it. We try to escape. We try to forget. But there's this problem. It's my problem. It's your problem. Are you ready? This is the worst part. Here's the truth. Are you ready? Is that whatever pain my failure has caused, I actually deserve. I did it. I'm guilty. I failed. I caused pain in me, and the worst part is I caused pain in the ones that I love, and it's sitting in my hand, and it's wrecking me. I should have to pay. All the shame, I should be ashamed. I should be so ashamed. The shame should be unbearable. And you know what? I deserve to be isolated, like Judas all by himself with nowhere to go. I deserve to be by myself because I've earned it. I've hurt the people I loved. The truth is, when the enemy looks at me and says, "You are finished," he's right. Except for one thing. Just one little thing. Is that where Satan tries to tell me that this is my problem, Jesus steps in and says, "You know what? I'll take that. That all the pain I've caused myself and my parents and the people around me," Jesus says, "You know what? Bind my hands, stretch my back, take a handle about this long with 9 cords coming off the side with teeth and bones and glass and rocks, and wrap it across my back until it looks like raw meat. I will take the pain." And then after that, you know what? Throw a cape on my back. Throw this mock cape. Sit down and just smack me on the head with a stick. And then once my blood has dried in that cloth, I want you to just rip it off my back. And throw a beam, 75 pounds plus. After I'm about to bleed out anyway, set a beam across my back. That pain that you earned yourself, that's mine. I'll take it right here. And then I'll walk until I can't walk anymore, he says. And you can drive stakes through my outstretched arms and one through the sides of my feet, with my knees bent to this point where the only way he'll be able to breathe is to press up off the nails in his ankles just long enough to gasp for air until gravity rips him down again for the nails in his wrists to catch. All that pain that we deserve, Jesus says, I'll take that. All that guilt that we feel, all the accusations that we bear, all those things that we know are true and they're warranted. When we look at this, it's like, I can't even wiggle out. It's true. Jesus, who had no guilt, says, I'll take that. 6 mock trials, throw the accusations right here. I'll take that. The one who was ever not guilty said, your guilt, give it to me. That thing in your hand that you did, give it to me. I'll take it. Sham trials, lies across, he paid the price for all of it. You know that shame that Satan tries to throw at you because of that thing in your hand right here? Let's talk about soldiers mocking and bowing down. Let's talk about him hanging on the side of the road on a tree, cursed, hung on a tree until he was dead. But as strangers who didn't even know what was coming by mock him and throw things all the way along, the shame that you're terrified that someone might find out because of this thing in your hand, Jesus says, I took that. I'll take that. Oh, you don't have to. I'll take it. Hand it to me. When Satan tries to drive us into isolation, Jesus says, don't take that. He says, I took that. Isolated, abandoned by all the men who had followed him, women following at a distance, hanging on the cross, even from his Father God, saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Can I just tell you this right here? That when Satan tries to say, this is your problem, Jesus steps in and says, nope, that's my problem. And when Satan tries to accuse you, the enemy tries to accuse you, your mind tricks and all the guilt things that start to play on you, you start to believe and buy into the lie that you are finished. Jesus steps in, and with his final words on the cross in John chapter 19, he says this. When Jesus had tasted it, he said, it is finished. And then he bowed his head and he released his spirit. You see, the truth is, students, is that you are not finished. It is finished. That there is nothing left to be paid. That the very thing that has been killing you, the thing that is weighing heavy, the thing you're constantly trying to escape, the thing you have no idea where to set it, Jesus looks at it and says, it's finished. You don't have to carry it anymore. And not kind of finished. I know sometimes we think it's kind of finished. You know what I'm saying? Like when somebody goes to a restaurant and there's a bill that comes out and everybody's like chipping in and there's just a little bit left to be paid and you got to kick in just a little bit more. I know that feels right, but that's not it at all. This word finished is paid in full. There is nothing lacking. You don't need to own the guilt. You don't need to own the shame. You don't need to own the isolation. None of that is yours to carry anymore. You see, this one little thing, just this little twist from I am finished to it is finished makes all the difference in the world. Jesus killed the very thing that's been killing you. And you owe nothing anymore. You see, death is final. It's what wrecks us about suicide. It's what wrecks us about death. It's just so final. But here's the beauty, students, is it's not your death. It was his. On the cross, Jesus killed everything that's been killing us. Take this right here. Hold your hand out. Call it to mind. You don't have to carry this anymore. This right here, your failure no longer defines you. Look, I get that you failed. I know that you failed. I know that I've failed. But Jesus came for people who fail. And he doesn't look at us and say, that's your problem. He doesn't look at you and say, you're finished. He looks at you and says, that's my problem. And it's finished. And you are no longer named by your failure. Your name is now Christian. Your name is now beloved. Your name is now holy. Your name is now adopted and forgiven and free and filled. So what do you do with your failure? You take it to Jesus. And you hand it to him because he paid for it a long time ago. You get to take this and set it aside. But Judas held it all by himself. And it was fatal. Peter retreats to his community. And some people walk him through a season long enough to realize that it was finished. And you'll find out in the next few days. I wish I could tell you the whole story. That what should have killed him and drove him into isolation instead becomes the very point that drives what we read earlier, that he understood what brand new life and life to the full really meant. And so I want you to imagine, what would happen if you stopped carrying this? What would life look like if you could set this down once and for all? Now, don't get me wrong, Satan's gonna try to put it back in your hand like on Tuesday of next week. He's gonna try to accuse you, and then we just look at him and say, you know what, dude, it's finished. I don't receive that anymore. What would it look like if you could join your youth group, you could step in there, and instead of carrying it by yourself, say, this is where I've come from, and then look you in the eye and say, that right there, that's finished. That's not who you are anymore. What if you jumped in with Paul when he says in Romans, who could stand against us? What if you actually believed this? Not like believed in Jesus, but what if you believed Jesus when he said it's finished? That there's no one who can stand against us because the one who can conquer the grave stands with us. There's no one who can stand against us anymore. What if you actually believed when Paul says, who can accuse us, that the answer is nothing? That when you go home and you want to step into some great kingdom work for God, or heaven forbid you fail and it doesn't go the way that you want, and he says, you see, I told you, you've always been like this. You've always do this. You always say you're going to come through and you don't. You are a failure. And you say, you can't accuse me because it is finished. And you go to your group and they remind you, yeah, that's not you. No one can stand against us. No one can accuse us because the one has declared us innocent. What about that guilt that Satan's going to try to throw on you and try to put it right back in your hand? Paul asks the question, who can judge us? The answer is no one, because the judge, the only one fit to judge, says, I'll take that. He took our guilt so that we could be declared innocent. We don't receive guilt. It's not ours to carry anymore. Who can isolate us? Paul says nothing. There is nothing anywhere that can separate us from the love of God. And so let me ask you just a simple question. Are you ready? Hold your hand out. What do you want to do with that? Call all of it to mind. Don't leave anything out. Every single failure. You can do one of two things with this. You can hold on to it, and you can let it define you. You can carry the shame. You can carry the guilt. You can let it drive you into isolation. And I can tell you what your end then will be. It'll be fatal. It'll be half-life. It'll be nothing like what God has called you into. But instead, you know what you could do? You could believe Jesus when he says, it's finished. And you could just give it to him. And you could walk free, forgiven, that nothing can separate you from God. You could walk without the weight. Not because it didn't happen, that's denial. Not because it didn't matter, that's a lie. Not because it didn't hurt, because it did. But because instead of you carrying it any longer, Jesus paid for it, and you let the gospel take effect in your life, and you said, I don't live that way anymore. I will not carry that anymore. You can throw that at me. You can try to get me to carry it. You can try to get it to stick, but that's not who I am. Not because of anything I have ever done, but because of what Jesus did for me. And so I take his name, and I take his freedom, and I take his payment, and I live with him from this moment forever. And we step into this life that a total failure named Peter called a brand new life with everything to live for. And he says, the future starts now. We're going to do something really awesome tonight. If you're tired of holding this, if you would believe Jesus that it's actually finished, we're going to invite you to come up and do this thing. We're gonna put this awful, ugly bottle of brown stuff in your hand, symbolizing all of those things that you've been carrying around, those labels you've accepted, those accusations, those failures. And I just want you to take your hand, I want you to put it around this bottle, and just one time on this pure, perfect, beautiful white canvas. I just want you to own that right there. That we've taken this opportunity and this beautiful thing called life that God has given us. And the truth is we put that right there. But as it flies out of the bottle, I want you just to imagine releasing all of that and just handing it to the pure and beautiful and spotless one, Jesus. And saying, you know what, I'm not holding that anymore. Jesus, I'm handing that to you. And just receive in a physical moment this action that Jesus invites you to live forgiven, with nothing left to be paid, to live free of the weight and the guilt and the shame, able to live into all that he has called you into, that you would live filled, not with remorse, but with this Spirit, boldly and confidently called into all that he is inviting you to do, even though you failed, even though you will fail at times. To step out of this idea that you are finished and to step into the truth that it is finished. That there is a day that you're invited into to stand right alongside Peter when in 1 Peter chapter 1 he says, brand new life and everything to live for. Christian, the future starts